Hi there, and welcome to the Aura Report. Today, my guest is the inimitable Ian Thornton-Trump again. Ian has a military intelligence background, and it shows. And he's also a cybersecurity expert, and have changed a company and positions and a bit of a trajectory as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah, sure. I spent 5 years roughly being a CISO for a threat intelligence company named Cyjax, and I've now joined a company called Inversion 6, which is more fractional CISO. So still a component for threat intelligence is probably what I'm known most for in my public persona, but this is more around the leadership required as a CISO, making intelligence-backed decisions, and of course, educating the executive team and board around threat, and much broader than just cyber, but also geopolitical, which is why I love the Aura Report, why I'm a huge fan, and why it's just my absolute pleasure to be on the show.
Yes, and I had a look at some of your recent speeches, and very interesting they were, I have to say.
Thank you.
And you're absolutely right, it does tie in perfectly because conflict prediction is how I ended up. I'm going to pull up a slideshow.
All right.
Okay, so just a brief background for people who don't know or have forgotten. The Aura Report excludes religion and ideology as primary drivers of war, and I absolutely stand by that, even in the face of what is happening in Israel. And we focus on oil, LNG, resources, where the military bases are, logistics, supply chain, trade routes, maritime choke points. Then I also look for what I call unknown unknowns, by which I mean I'll know it when I see it. And I pay extreme attention to what leaders and generals say. So I factor that in. Then, in addition to that, the broader background is really great game theory. And that is the Russian Empire versus the British Empire, which has now morphed into the Anglo-American Empire. And we are not sure if is there some sort of a schism between London and Washington at this point? Would you say, yeah?
Absolutely 100% a schism. A lot has happened since we last did this video podcast. And I think the UK, the United Kingdom, sort of the remnants of that colonialism, post-colonial era, British Empire, Commonwealth, has failed on two issues. The first issue is convincing everyone except Europe that the Ukraine-Russian conflict is almost a pan-global conflict instead of a regional fisticuff in Eastern Europe. It's not that. It's way bigger than that. The second problem is that the UK is trying to act predictably in a situation where American foreign policy is completely unpredictable. And this is moving them closer to more of a European sphere and a Chinese engagement. So obviously, the Chinese have vested interests globally, but they manifest, I would say, tangibly in Africa and the Far East, which makes sense given the Belt and Road Initiative and some of the other power projection capabilities that they have. But what I think the UK is really struggling to do here is constrain great powers not being a great power anymore. So it's really tough to leverage the United Kingdom's current global capability and actually constrain companies that are potentially expansionists and at the same time not rely on American capabilities and influence. And so it's really bizarre. It's completely unbalanced. It's unsettling. And I think we're still struggling with mechanisms to move foreign policy in a non-conflict oriented era. The levers that we used to use to make change in the world, I don't think are working particularly well anymore.
Yes, and recently I was researching the nature. Where did the special relationship between the United Kingdom and America start? And it's actually weird that I hadn't looked it up before, but the special relationship was proposed by Churchill in a speech in the USA. And it was basically we're going to share intelligence and share military power, and we are going to use that to expand our influence globally, if I have it correct.
Yes, but there was a little matter of the extraordinary amount of money that America lent to Europe and the United Kingdom. And in my mind, special relationship means very generous terms when it comes to paying back that. And this is indicative of the American foreign policy. I would say major beef is that nations have been essentially on the coattails of America's largesse, that global trade is enforced by the US Navy and no other, and that even though one would argue that the American economy was the chief beneficial of global trade and globalism, there's now this belief that it costs too much. It's just not worth it. And we are seeing the unpredictable, some may say even crazy ramifications of what is emerging to be a trade war between China and the United States, to the point where, as you know, China returned a Boeing aircraft, a $55 million aircraft, because they said, we're not paying the tariffs. Take it back. Don't need it. And you know, there is no real tariff between Airbus, the chief competitor of Boeing, and China. So if you think that America is attempting to become this superior power through trade wars and tariffs, I think, you know, as a Canadian, we're seeing the ramifications of a renewed Canadian nationalism, which is going to sweep the Conservative government out completely, destroy that party, I think, as a national party in Canada, and bring in an era of a majority, which will be the first time in quite a long time, a majority government in Canada built around liberal policies. The exact opposite of what is going on in the United States right now. So, I mean, to get back to your point about the special relationship, I think that was basically torn up in the last 100 days or so of the American presidency. There will be a relationship, but I don't think it will be as equals. And I don't think politically the two nations, the United Kingdom and America, are aligned. And this seems evident from everything from the rule of law and constitutional precedents in the United States to the actual drawback of America's commitment globally.
I have noticed that, and it is disturbing. And of course, the situation in Ukraine is now very much up in the air and unclear. Trump's last words, I believe, were, well, if they won't come to an arrangement, then we'll kind of disengage and leave them to it.
Yeah, and so a point about that is really this. Europe has realized that it was far easier to get America involved in these things than it was to make the hard choices themselves. Now that there is no easy way of basically living again on America's investment, and we can argue whether or not Russian influence and curtailing it was in the American national interest or not, but it's certainly in the European interest. And this is why the German government, the French government, Poland, many of these countries in Europe have said, we now look at the Ukrainian struggle as a European struggle against Russian aggression. And I think that changed the dynamic, and Ukraine will fight on. And Ukraine, I think, will rely more on European partners, as well as partners like Canada and Australia, to bolster their capability and support. And I do think that the sudden vacuum of American power will not be terminal for the Ukraine. I think this struggle will go on. I think that Ukraine, with American support to defeat Russia, would have happened probably, I would say, in 9 months to a year from now. Now, without Russian or without American support, I think we're looking at another 3 years or so before Russia is exhausted in the fight.
My impression is there was a point at which Russia was looking at off-ramps. My concern is that they have now become perhaps dependent on a war economy, and this insistence on basically the Istanbul Plus, which is they want all the territories ceded, and Ukraine's position is that cannot happen, is leading to a major impasse. I don't see America brokering their way through those negotiations, so I don't actually see this war ending anytime soon. The framework of time that you've offered is probably closer to it. But in the meantime, Russia isn't, of course, only in Ukraine, it is all over Africa and everywhere else. And this goes back to the great game, and it does seem to me that it is on. And in some ways, America is a participant. For instance, there's a lot of activity at Diego Garcia Base, which is in the Chagos Islands. And that was an awkward situation where Keir Starmer he returned it. Well, it was never Mauritius's island, technically, but it was given to Mauritius, and then the USA obviously had a military base there that has suddenly become very, very active and prominent. So they aren't entirely out of the picture. They do seem to be focusing on their own interests, which may not align with Europe any longer. With the United Kingdom, I feel like there is, with the Ukraine, it goes back to the Crimean War and the whole Mackinder's Heartland and Stryker's Rimland theories. And so there's this very strong sense that if we lose control of this portion of land, this sort of middle of the world, then it's going to be catastrophic and other powers are going to come in. I must tell you that there was a point where I thought, oh, the West is very aggressive and imperialist. And then one day I was going through history and I looked through every single invasion into the west of Europe came from the east. And suddenly I realized, oh no, there is actually a reason why this is in place, because they would be overrun. And there are other powers with ambitions, and we aren't taking them into account. To add to the Russian Anglo-American conflict as it started, I would say we now have Iran and China. It stands by itself. India is an independent player, but it is a major player nonetheless. And then I feel like we have got another shadow player, and that is the caliphate. I'm going to refer to them broadly as the caliphate because I've been investigating the financial power and soft power being exercised from the Middle East, and it is quite staggering. And then, of course, the other things that I've focused on, we've mentioned BRICS and the BRI and de-dollarization. The US national debt always seems to be a possible flashpoint for a world war, because I don't think you can pay it back, even with Doge and cuts, I'm not sure. And also, I've kept the Arctic in mind, and I've also been looking at trade routes, alternative trade routes to the Red Sea, because the Red Sea and the Black Sea have been a mighty big hold-up for the past couple of years.
Definitely.
So, okay, so just to briefly go through my predictions, I always thought Ukraine would be the fuse to World War III. And I thought the supply of LNG was going to be a key driver of tensions. I didn't think green energy was going to replace the need for oil and gas. my sort of Aura report rule of thumb is where the oil and gas floweth.
Or goeth. Yeah.
Yep. That's basically it. It's just wherever you look, going back to World War I and II. And then also all of these rebel groups that we're seeing in Africa, that they are really poor. Where are they getting their weapons? Also, the context of General Wesley Clark, and I know he's just made a statement recently, but I haven't been able to look at it properly. But remember his 7 countries in 5 years? So those countries were always in the frame of reference when it came to conflict prediction for me. Mm-hmm. And then in 2022, I predicted Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Turkey, the Baltics, Bosnia, Kosovo, Armenia, Poland, Sahel, South Africa, China, Taiwan, Pakistan, Balochistan, Afghanistan, sort of going in over there. And I also said in 2021, actually, I said gold is going to go up remarkably because of de-dollarization. And that has gone as I predicted. And the other thing I did was I looked at a company called Cheniere. I just picked them randomly and I thought, well, I'm going to be able to track LNG via this company. And from 2021, late 2021 to now, you can see there's been a considerable increase. It came to me that if I was going to be accurate, I would have to check my predictions against what the market was doing. And at that point, I started looking at what is the market doing. And I have to say, with this type of prediction, it's not just gold, but businesses strategically, they could very easily take advantage of the type of prediction that I do. So my whole aim initially was actually conflict avoidance. And then you sent me a very interesting article, Critical Threats, about what is going on in Africa. And we've discussed this before, and we've had this map before, and this is the tentacles of Iran throughout Africa.
Yeah, so Africa has now become a really interesting and geopolitical mess. And part of it is, of course, the rise in popularism of Islamic export from Iran. Iran truly believes in building allies and consensus throughout the world. This is probably a bit of a hedge to 2 things. One is sanctions avoidance, so being able to use multiple countries in order to continue to feed the Iranian economy. And then also on top of that, raw recruits for the various extracurricular Iranian activities vis-a-vis Houthis, Hamas, or Hezbollah, in terms of raw materials, shall we say, for the export of global jihad. Now, it is clear from anyone that's doing the analysis right now is that Iran's only card that they have left to play after an incredibly aggressive Israeli counterterrorism operation, both to the south and to the north, and now America engaging the Houthis directly with airstrikes, significant airstrikes. Although we need to put those in a bit of, I would say they haven't been quite as effective as we've been led to believe, and there's a number of reasons why. But ultimately, what I think set everything off in the Middle East recently in terms of all of the prediction is the sudden disappearance of Syria and the less scary ISIS dude taking over as the kind of head of a Syrian government. I'm going to put quotations. At the same time, with the rise of an pro-Assad regime along some of the coastal areas, which of course are the most important and strategic areas of Syria. So what I was thinking about a month ago has now drastically changed. Now, a couple of things. Let's go back to Africa because I think it's really important. Geopolitics abhors a vacuum. And what has happened is the United States has still maintained some a semblance of a counterterrorism operation in Africa, as have a couple of other nations. However, what has gone on now is a bunch of small regional conflicts that are backed typically by one side, and that is Iran, except when there's strategic materials involved, and then it's Russia or potentially China, but mostly Russia, that is going after control of the strategic minerals, whereas Iran, in my mind, is trying to export its version of global jihad to many African countries and destabilizing governments and regions. So it's a mess. And this is exacerbated now by America's decision to curtail U.S. aid and programs like HIV treatment, which was funded by the West. Those programs have now been more or less shut down. Any nation that has the capability of providing both food, and I'm going to use the quotations, aid, because it will come with a lot more strings attached, and or retroviral treatment for HIV, is going to win the lion's share of African governments, because the era of American soft power is over. And the result is now going to be a move away from Western engagement by most African countries to engagement with the Middle East, geography being a major factor in that, but also because the Far East and the Middle East have more to offer Africa and are willing to invest in Africa, whereas it appears that the major Western power, the Americans, are retreating from Africa. And that is going to upset geopolitical dynamics, I think, for at least half a lifetime. So a baby that's born today in Africa to about age 25, because I think the average life expectancy in Africa is somewhere over the age of 50. You're talking about an entire generation that will fondly remember when America was engaged in Africa, but now must turn to either a Chinese or Iranian, possibly Saudi, although they don't seem to be very interested in any other country except Egypt, perhaps. But I think what we're seeing is a new era of colonialism in Africa, but it's going to be a Chinese and Middle Eastern endeavor and no longer Western colonialism or European colonialism. So could there be great opportunities for Africa in all of this? I think is the big question in my mind. And I think perhaps it remains to see if Africans can kind of choose between the Iran Islamic view with strings attached, if you will, or the pure commercial opportunity that China offers. And I feel that the poor youth with nothing to do will be attracted to the Islamic view that Iran and embrace Iranian, but they aren't the governments of these countries. And I think the governments will be far more pragmatic and will move towards the Chinese sphere. I'd love to hear what you think about that thesis.
A lot to break down over there. The first interesting thing is when I predicted Syria was, my whole prediction was if Ukraine went, then Israel would go, then Syria would go, Lebanon, they would all have to go in a pattern. It couldn't be one or the other. And what I was looking at was the supply of energy to Europe. And I thought, if there's a fight and Russia no longer supplies energy to Europe, where is it going to come from next? And the pipelines, there's the Russia and Syria had a pipeline, and then there's the Turkey-Qatar pipeline, and then there is the gas basin that Israel, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, Greece all share.
Right.
And what I have picked up is Qatar Energy is the most successful LNG enterprise. That is their market, and they intend to corner it. And so I would say any competitors to their gas supply would be in trouble. If you look at what happened in Syria, HTS and Jalani, Jarrah, whatever he calls himself, when they came in, I noticed some of the footage that I saw on Telegram, Turkish flags, a lot of Turkish flags. So this is very much a Turkish-backed play. And I see that as a sort of an Ottoman Empire revival, and as well as protecting the pipelines.
And protecting, and I think ensuring that the Kurdish threat was reduced to as minimal possible. But I want to go back to Qatar Energy because Canada ended up becoming a major player in all of this because of the fight with the United States. Canada did a deal with Japan for LNG. And I think Canada is looking very seriously at exporting LNG through an eastern port, of which we don't currently have the facility. So the facility is obviously now a national priority. It never used to be when we could send LNG to the south, but now we can't. So we're in this position where we can kind of like supply one side of Europe fairly easily, but then have Qatar Energy supply that other side of Europe. So I think the Qataris will look at most crises as an opportunity. And I think what we're also seeing is numbers coming out of Europe showing that nuclear, and even nuclear in Germany, is now got an uptick in popular potential, shall we say. We're seeing the green energy sources like wind and solar increasing in the net amount of electricity being contributed. However, we have a problem in Europe, and we have a problem in North America, and we have a problem in the UK, and that is artificial intelligence's growing energy demands. So the fallback for energy production in most European countries, not all, but most European countries, is using LNG to power turbines to create electricity. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So there are some thermal related energy production in Norway, for instance, and Iceland. Interestingly enough, I was just there for a conference, could quite easily be energy independent completely by the thermal generating capabilities that are present in Iceland. A bit disconcerting to have a volcano located that close to your capital, but hey, what do you do, right? But really, really interesting because, again, had we had this conversation a month ago, who knows, right? Now we're seeing these massive shifts in relationships as a result of the unpredictable behavior of the United States. And to be fair, it's creating a whiplash, like a shockwave at the front of a supernova, if you will, of just quite frankly ill will and difficulty. And then, of course, with the reduction in the American government, and there are folks that argue that it was long overdue, that the American government had become bloated. What I will say is that if the person that you used to call when you had a problem is no longer there and you don't know who to call, diplomacy and relationships suffer. You know, this comes on the heels of the decision to close about 30 embassies and consulates. That reduces the availability of the Americans to either gather human source intelligence, to understand what is going on in those populaces, to track anti-Americanism, anti-Semitism, all of the type of global movements that will gain a foothold as America reduces its capacity to be visible and to be present. And I think this is the crux of the issue when it comes to LNG and energy, in that America is now going to look at producing for itself and trying to completely get off imports. Imports and exports are the basis of trade relationships. And to move away from that so rapidly and abruptly, I think will redefine the global order in a very short order. And this goes to your thesis about World War III. I agree that a world war, because of the shooting of one archduke, for instance, will no longer happen in our particular society. I think that was an outlier. So is the invasion of countries by foreign powers. It took several countries to be invaded before we are at with a world war. But I think your argument for a potential world war is the confluence of many regional conflicts that then become so disruptive to trade, imperil energy, imperil international relations, to the point where we can't fly aircraft over 1/3 of the world because there's a danger of surface-to-air missiles being shot at civilian aircraft. When we get to that point, we kind of find ourselves not declaring a war, but finding ourselves that our day-to-day experiences are now a world war. So, I think there's a famous quote, not with a bang, but with a whisper or a whimper. I think what you're talking about right now is the first whimper war, where regional conflicts combine in a way that then destabilizes the world order, to the point where we now have other regional conflicts that essentially require us choosing sides, like Taiwan and China, the Philippines and China, Russia and Poland, or Lithuania, or the Baltics might be one of the flashpoints for that particular scenario, as you've outlined. So you're right. I think we are in a much more difficult place than we were even a couple of months ago.